Now here last week, we were looking at some of the patristic assumptions on which their belief was that the first century A.D. was around the year 5500. 5,500 years after Genesis 1 in creation. We said that we're not discounting their date of 5,500 years after creation, but at the same time we're not accepting it. It's certainly going to be more in line with things than Ussher's theory, as well as a lot of other people's theories. But we were looking at those assumptions. The first of those was the analogy of the creation days with 1,000-year period. The second one was the appeal that was made to the chronologies in the 5th and the 11th chapters of Genesis. The third one was the symbolic number view, where Hippolytus tried to find a couple of verses in John and Revelation and so forth to find out exactly how old the earth was. And we said that none of these really deserved any further attention besides the second one, and that was the appeal made to the chronologies and to the genealogies back in Genesis chapters 5 and 11. The only reason why this is the only one out of the three that's worth looking at is because it's based evidently quite directly upon a couple of passages of Scripture. Now, Hippolytus's symbolic number view was based upon some passages of Scripture, but falsely so. But this appeal back to Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 certainly deserves more attention, because we've got two whole chapters here that give us just one number after another. And so the assumption is, we're talking, remember, about the age of the earth and the date of creation. The assumption is, why can't we now go back to these two chapters and just add some figures up here and give ourselves a date of how long a time existed between Adam and the flood and how long a time existed between the flood and Abram. That would take us from Genesis 1 to Genesis 12. Why stop there? Because once we get to Abram, we've got his date, 2200 B.C. And then we know our date, 1984 A.D. So we can add those up, and we'll add that with our numbers from 1 through 12 in Genesis, and we would have a very reliable date for creation. But that assumes certain things about chapters 5 and 11 that may not necessarily be true. If you'll turn back to chapter 5, and hopefully now you'll have your calculators with you if you want to be adding along with us. We want to take a few moments out here in the beginning to just see what ages, what years, what number of years, what period of time we can really get from chapter 5 and chapter 11. There are some accepted dates that generally are memorized, 1656, that's a certain date of number of years, and some other ones that people just assume are true because they have read through Genesis 5 and 11. Because they've done more than that, they've added up some of the numbers they found in Genesis 5 and 11. But what I want to do is give you, well, really we've got 4 points here, and we're going to have to work our way backwards. So if you're wanting to get it down in order on your paper, you'll have to leave yourself some room and skip down to number 4, because as we've said earlier, whenever we're working with our chronology here, we've got to start with where we are right now. We don't know when creation was. That's what we're trying to find out. If we knew what that was, then we could work forward in time. But we do know when we're living, so we can work backwards. So we're going to have around 4 steps, which are 4 periods of time. We're going to try to find out how many years are in these 4 periods of time. You add all of them up, and you ought to have the date of creation. Okay, so we're going to start, as I say, working backwards. We'll start with number 4 and work back to number 1. Now, obviously, the 4th period of time would be from Christ until the present. We're going to deal just with these large groups of time that we can easily tell. Keeping out of the picture the statistics that show us Christ was really born several years BC, we're going to try to keep in mind that there was such thing as a year 0, which of course is an impossibility. When you go from 1 BC, the next year you come to is 1 AD, which really means you skip 2 years there instead of just 1. There was no year 0. Keeping all of that out of the picture as far as Jesus being born 4 years before the year 0, and pretending that there was such thing as the year 0, then from Christ until the present was 1984 years. And you see, I don't want to say 1988, or really you got another one added in there, maybe 1989, because that would throw people off. And someone that got the tape next week would wonder why we think we're living several years in advance when we're not living. It would be 1989 then. So from Christ to the present, 1984 years, barring all the technical statistics that we don't need to get into. Then we'll work back to point 3, from Abram to Christ. Now we're going to have to give our specific date now, 2167 years. That was Old Testament introduction, where we looked at the date of Abram. 2167, that of course would be BC, 1984 AD. You add those up, you've got the time from Abram until now. Then if you go over to chapter 11, now we've got the date of Abram's birth, 2167. The immediate important event prior to Abram would be the flood. So how long between the flood and Abram? All right, this is found in Genesis 11, verses 10 through 26. So we'll start back here with verse 10. All you have to do really is read the even number verses, because they are the ones that give you the years when the son was born. The odd number verses give how many years in total the individual lived after he had begot the son, as well as the reference to other children, sons and daughters, being born. So verse 10, these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. So we're going to have to add all these numbers up now as we go along. You add them up on your calculator, on your paper, do it in your head, or just sit there and read and listen. We begin with 2 years. We're wanting to know the time from the flood until Abram. So Arpachshad was not born until 2 years after the flood, so we start with 2 years. Then verse 12. Arpachshad lived 35 years and begat Shelah. So then you can add that. Then verse 14. Shelah lived 30 years and begat Eber. I'll go slowly enough so you can add in your mind if you're fast enough. Eber lived 34 years and begat Peleg. Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. Reu lived 32 years and begat Serug. Serug lived 30 years and begat Nahor. Nahor lived 29 years and begat Terah. And then verse 26, and Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram. Now that's fairly easy just to run through these few verses from verse 10 down through verse 26. It gives you a total of 292 years. So far we've gone back a long time in history, from the time of Christ back to the time of Abram. And now subtract 292 years and we're all the way back to the time of the flood. Now, of course, the one other period of time, the first period of time, which will give us our 4 periods, is the time from Adam to the flood. So we'll have from Adam to the flood, then from the flood to Abram, then from Abram to Christ, and then from Jesus Christ to us. And that's about as far as you can get either way. You're all the way back to Adam, and you're all the way up to us. So that's about all the time you'd need, and that would give you a date for creation. This is found in Genesis chapter 5, verses 3 through 29. And here all you have to do is look at every third verse. Every third verse gives you the period of time that we need to calculate to find out the ages here. The second and third verses in each little subsection simply gives additional material. So that would be such as verse 3, verse 6, verse 9, verse 12, all additions of 3, and so forth, all the way down through 29. Now we'll add this up and see what we get. Verse 3, Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. So we've got 130 years from the beginning, from the time of Adam, until the time Seth is born. Then Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. Then Enos lived 90 years and begat Cainan. In verse 12, Cainan lived 70 years and begat Mahalaleel. In verse 15, Mahalaleel lived 65 years and begat Jared. In verse 18, Jared lived 162 years and begat Enoch. Verse 21, Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. Verse 25, Methuselah lived 187 years and begat Lamech. Then verse 28, really we stop with 28 here. Well, we got to go into 29 to get his name, Noah. That's why I mentioned that as the last verse. Lived 182 years and begat a son. Now what do you have when you add all that up? You have 1,556 years. However, all that gives us is until the time of Noah. Then we've got to go down to verse 32. Noah lived 500 years, and then he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Really, the 500 gives you your 1556. So we're down to 1556, the end of the chapter, but that's not the end. All that gives us is the time when one of these sons was born. We have to go down to chapter 7 and verse 6, because we know it wasn't until 100 years later, 120 after the time when Noah was 480, when God told him what he said he was going to do. 100 years after the son was born here, chapter 7, verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the flood of the waters was upon the earth, which gives you a total of 1,656 years between the time of Adam and the flood. So we've got, now we can work forward from Adam to the flood, 1,656 years. From the flood to Abram, 292 years. From Abram to Christ, 2,167 years, and from Jesus to the present, 1,984. So we have a date of creation, 6,099 years ago. Now you can't dispute the fact that it couldn't be any less than this. And so what I want to emphasize here for a moment before we go on and look at some other things is the fact that all of those people, so many of them, I taught in a school one time where I was teaching some things about the first few chapters of Genesis and disputing quickly day-age theory, gap theory, and so forth, and was met by someone afterward that said they believed that the earth was going to exist for 6,000 years, and they represented the 6 days of creation, and then the millennium would start, which would represent the seventh day of creation. Well, look at the figure you've got now. It's beyond contention that the earth couldn't be, that we couldn't have any smaller a date than this, 6,099 years ago. It's interesting that it appears to be right around 6,000, but these people are on the debit side, not the credit side, because the earth would have had to have come to an end 99 years ago in order for this so-called analogy, this day-age analogy theory, where one day represents 1,000 years of subsequent successive human history. And you're going to run into a lot of people who believe this. Some of them charismatic, some of them not charismatic, that believe that we're going to have 6,000 years of history. Remember, Archbishop Usher's date was 4004, and everyone believes that the end is just about upon us. So we've got about 2,000 years on this side. So the end is going to be coming in the next few years, and guess what? That'll equal a total of 6,000 years. Impossibility. Because so far, a minimum of 6,099 years that we can prove have already passed. Now that, of course, assumes that you've heard what we've said before about the date of Abraham at 2167. And once a person accepts that date, which is really not disputable, then we just went through the passages of the Bible here and added all the other texts and all the other numbers up. When you add those up, you get 6,099. The earth couldn't be a day younger than 6,099 years old. Now, it could be older than that, but it couldn't be a day younger than 6,099. And so what this proves right off the bat is that first assumption that the patristic writers, many of them, were using, that was first found in the Epistle of Barnabas, is simply wrong. And it also proves that so many charismatics today who have somehow picked up that I don't know from where or whom theory that the earth is going to exist 6,000 years and then the millennium starts, they are also wrong. And you have to keep these things in mind because it sounds so plausible whenever someone presents you with the idea and with the statistics that, according to Archbishop Usher, the date of creation was 4004 BC, and it fits so neatly. I mean, it just didn't happen to be 10,004 BC. It just happened to be 4004 BC, and we at this time just happened to be 2,000 years AD. And so you add them up, you got 6,000 years. And some people, without even thinking, will assume that that's the Bible proof right away. That because so many people believe that creation was around 4,000 BC, and we're living 2,000 AD, it's not like we are 3,000 AD or 500 AD. Now, that would ruin the theory. But since we're 2000 AD, and since so many people believe that we're living in the last days, and they say, well, see, God was letting us know ahead of time that we were going to be here around 6,000 years. But assuming that you accept our date of Abraham, 2167 BC, then you can't get away from the fact that the earth can't be a day younger than 6,099 years young, old, of age, whatever you want to say. Now, don't turn away from chapters 5 and 11 because we'll be back there. The question we have to ask, though, about the genealogies in the 5th and 11th chapter of Genesis is the following, and that is, are we to take these as strictly and literally successive genealogies and chronologies, or can we hold to some form of a gap chronology view? Now, a gap theory of creation is wrong, but what about a gap chronology theory, a gap chronology view, that the genealogies and the chronology of time given in the 5th and 11th chapters of Genesis are not to be taken successively? That is, just because, for instance, in chapter 5, verse 3, Adam lived 130 years, begat Seth. Then verse 6, Seth lived 105 years, begat Enos. Then verse 9, Enos lived 90 years and begat Cainan. Could there be some breaks in between this that perhaps we aren't told of right here? Does it necessarily mean, and we're not passing judgments yet, but does it necessarily mean when it says in verse 6 that Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos, that Enos has to be the immediate successive son of Seth? You see, that's the question. Now, it's pretty quiet in here, so I trust you're following along, and we got a lot more to say besides what we're saying now, but you're going to have to be thinking as we go along, because some of these things appear to be obvious when, if you take the obvious, you just may well be wrong. Seth lived, verse 6, 105 years, and begat him, Enos. Well, does that mean that Enos is the son of Seth? We know from back up in verse 3 that Seth is the son of Adam, because we're told that in chapter 4 and verse 25. Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. So Adam knew Eve, Eve bare a son, Eve named him Seth. So we know that Seth was Adam's son. What about Enos and his relationship to Seth? Or we could go down to verse 12. What about the relationship between Mahalalel and Cainan? Does Mahalalel have to be the son of Cainan? Well, if you take the obvious inference here of verse 12, or of verse 6, or of verse 9, or of 4:25, or of 5:3, or of any of the other third verses as we go along, then yes, it would appear that the father's name is mentioned, and then his immediate descendant, which would be his son, is mentioned after him. Now, if this is always true, then there aren't any gaps. If perhaps sometimes this is not true, then perhaps we can hold to some form of a gap chronology view. Now, up until just over 100 years ago, it was universally accepted and believed that the chronologies and the genealogies in chapter 5 and chapter 11 were successively in order. That is, there were no gaps there. But in the year 1863, a professor by the name of William Henry Green, professor of theology and Oriental literature at Princeton Seminary in New Jersey, Presbyterian Seminary in New Jersey, published a little article, or wrote a little article. It wasn't published until the spring, April of 1890, in a theological journal known as Bibliotheca Sacra, which is now under the auspices of Dallas Seminary in Texas, by the name of Primeval Chronology. He wrote it in 63, and it was finally published in Bibliotheca Sacra in 1890, April of 1890. And in this article, I've got a copy of it, and I don't have it with me tonight, but I've got a copy somewhere of it. In this article, published back in 1890, it was for the first time suggested, and really Dr. Green did more than suggest, he more or less proved his case, that the genealogies in chapter 5 and chapter 11 are not to be taken literally and successively. By literally, I mean that just because it says that someone begat someone does not mean that the first name is the father and the second name is the son. Now, if we didn't have any proof of that, then we'd be in a lot of trouble, because the obvious meaning and the obvious appearance of the text is that the first name is the father and he begat so-and-so, and therefore the second name would be the son. So you're going to have proof that that's not true, because that appears to be what is said here. Keep in mind, however, if that's what's being said here, then I just gave you the date for creation, 6099. All you got to do is work backwards and add all these years on. So if that's true, we've already got the date of creation beyond any shadow of a doubt. 6099. That's how old the earth would be right now. However, if there are some gaps in the genealogy, then we don't have the date, or at least that couldn't be the date, 6099. So how do we know that these genealogies are not given to us chronologically and literally and consecutively and successively in order from father to son, then from that son to the next son, and so forth? Well, the material that we're going to be beginning to look at tonight, much of it anyway, is taken from some of the writings of Green, because he was the one who pioneered in this area the idea that we should do a little deeper study into chapters 5 and 11, compare them with some other portions of scriptures, and we'll be showing ourselves rather quickly that something else is being said here in chapter 5 and chapter 11, rather than just a strict chronology by which we could date creation or by which we could date the flood. I want to begin by looking at some internal reasons why the strict, what we can call the strict chronology interpretation of 5 and 11 simply is untenable. So some reasons militating against a strict chronology interpretation of chapters 5 and 11. Why is it important? Because everyone has their theory on how old the earth is. 3 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, 5 million, 2,000, 6,000. Everyone has their view. Who's right and who's wrong? And everyone is seeming to have some type of different view. Not even the scientists themselves can become settled on the fact, now, is it 5 billion or is it 5.2 billion? Not that it really makes any difference. Or is it 6 billion? Or was Usher right after all? Could the earth really only be 6,000 years? It sounds so reasonable that there were 4,000 years before Christ, and we know that we're living at the end of time right now. And if you add those up, you've got 6,000, and that really neatly fits back to Genesis 1 and the 6 days of creation. It sounds very logical and very believable. A lot of people believe it. That's why I say it sounds believable, because a lot of people do. So that's why we have to look at this. And besides that, we're given whole chapters here, 5 and 11. All of 5 and most of chapter 11 of nothing but all these numbers. So what does all that signify unless he's wanting us to understand something? Why waste all of our time here with all of these numbers unless he wants us to understand something? Amen. Now, if he wants us to understand the date of creation, then we're going to have a problem, because we're going to suggest, more than suggest, we're going to prove that they can't be taken in strictly chronological order here, which right away tells us, well, then we can't add these right up, the one with the other, and then find out what our date is for creation and what our date is for the time of the flood. But as we go along, you'll see that there are other reasons besides dating for which chapters 5 and 11 were given. So I said we're going to start by looking at some internal reasons militating against the strict chronology interpretation. In the first place, the number of the years is not totaled up after the list in chapter 5 and the list in chapter 11. Now, of course, someone in opposition could easily say, well, he gave us all the figures and Moses expects us to do the calculation ourselves. Why calculate it for us when all he has to do is write the numbers down and we can add the total up ourselves? Well, the problem with that opposition to our view is the fact that if you'll go back to chapter 5, although he's giving us 2 numbers in each case, how long it was between the time an individual was born, with the exception of Adam, and he had his firstborn son, assumingly anyway, that number, as well as how many days this man lived after his son, his firstborn, assuming that that was his firstborn son was born, and then he always adds that up for us. Watch this in chapter 5 and verse 3. Adam lived 130 years, begat a son in his likeness. So he lived 130 years and begat Seth. Then after Seth, he lived 800. Now their argument is, well, if any type of totaling was meant, then he would leave that up to us rather than do it himself. Well, verse 5, all the days that Adam lived were 930 years. Verse 6, Seth lived 105 years when he begat his son. Then after that son, he lived, verse 7, 807. And so I'll add that up for you. Moses said all the days of Seth were 912 years. In other words, whenever it's possible here, and so far it's been possible in every case, he gives us 2 figures, and then he adds the figures up for us. Why not then, at the end of the list, add all the figures up and tell us how much time elapsed here in this chapter? Unless it's impossible to do. Do you see what I'm saying? Amen. Now this goes on throughout chapter 5. He doesn't do it in chapter 11 because not the same material is given. A different material is given in chapter 11 than in chapter 5. But in chapter 5, he's always adding everything up for us, not leaving any of the addition up to us, except when we get to the very end of the list. In other words, if this was just a straight, strict chronology here, why not conclude it by saying, and this were how many years between, we could say, Adam and the birth of Noah, or Adam and the flood, or Adam and the birth of Noah's first son, but he doesn't add any of that up for us. So right away it should raise suspicion in one's mind concerning how you're going to interpret the genealogy here. In the second place, the genealogies in chapters 5 and 11 are in perfectly Well, let me say it another way. Before I say that, I want to make a comment, because if we go over to chapter 11 and someone counts up the names here, you see the genealogies here, what I was going to say, are perfectly symmetrical. You've got a list of 10 names in each one of these chapters. It kind of depends on how you add up the names, which names you count, which names you don't count over here in chapter 11. But assuming that we start with Shem, some of this you probably won't understand until I say other things, but you can always hear it on the tape. Assuming that we start with Shem, assuming that we're not missing any names in verses 11 and 12, then we can go all the way on down.
Further continue.
You can always hear it on the tape. Assuming that we start with Shem, assuming that we're not missing any names in verses 11 and 12, then we can go all the way on down until the time of Abram. Now, if we're missing some names, we might have to stop prior to Abram, like with Terah. And this is what we really have to do in this case, is stop with Terah, go from Shem to Terah. Therefore, in chapter 5 and in chapter 11, we see symmetry here in the fact that we are given 10 names in each chapter, the last of those names being a man that has 3 important sons. You go back to chapter 5, and of course the last name there is Noah. He has Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now you've got 9 names before him, then you have Noah's name, and then he has 3 important sons. Then in chapter 11, the 10th name would be Terah. He has 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, perhaps that looks to be a little artificial. Why just exactly, or we could say how, did it happen that we have just exactly 10 names, the last of those names being an important man who had 3 important sons? Let's assume for a moment that in one of the lists, perhaps in chapter 5, there really were only 10 people from the first name to the last name. But in chapter 11, there were 15. But in order to make it work out better, and perhaps to aid in memorization, as we see many times are done in the genealogies of the Old Testament, he would leave 5 names out, and he would end with a 10th name that would have 3 important sons, so it would match up comparingly with chapter 5. Therefore, you'd have 10 names in each chapter, and you'd have the last name having 3 important sons. Now, for a comparison, turn over to Matthew chapter 1. What we're saying now is the symmetry in the chapters, where you've got 10 names and the last one having 3 sons, looks a little artificial, and therefore appears to be a very valid reason for militating against a strict chronology interpretation of these 2 chapters. Now, you know we've got here in Matthew 1, which will probably become, well, I know we'll be coming back to it at a later time, but just to show you something in advance, Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, we have a genealogy that takes us from the time not of Adam, like Luke's does, but from Abraham, all the way up into the time of Jesus Christ. And it's broken down into 3 different categories. And these 3 categories are given to us here in verse 17 of Matthew 1. Now watch very carefully what is said, and then I'll surprise you with a comment afterwards. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. Now, how did that just happen to work out that there were exactly 14 generations between each one of these points of reference. Well, it didn't work out, because in some of them there were many more than 14 generations. But yet we're told plainly here that there were 14 generations between Abraham and David, then from David to captivity, and then from captivity to Jesus Christ. But we know all you got to do is read your Old Testament and you can prove that's not true. There weren't 14 generations from David until the carrying away in the captivity in Babylon. And we can prove that not to be true. The others certainly don't appear to be true. So what's the point? No doubt they're listed in this way to aid in memorization. He lists certain ones, includes certain ones, excludes certain others, to give us a rounded off figure, 14, 14, and 14. We'll be coming back to this, and I'll show you the points that we can prove. But the point now is that it's not true that we've got a strict chronology here in the first 16 verses of Matthew 1, although verse 17 says there were 14, 14, and 14. Therefore, if that's not true, then it's going to cast doubt on chapters 5 and 11 of Genesis, where you've got 10 names here, 10 names here, and the last of each of those names having 3 important sons. You see, it's too artificial just to have worked out that way, by accident. It's too artificial in Matthew 1:17 just to happen to have 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to captivity, from captivity to Christ. Too artificial to have it just like that. Now, of course, someone could argue, well, God worked it out that way. That would be fine. But the Old Testament, in its genealogies, proves that God didn't work it out that way, that there weren't exactly 14 between each one of those periods of time. Now, you see, you would never have known that reading Matthew 1 yourself. You would just accepted verse 17, that there were 14, 14, and 14. And no doubt if you would read chapters 5 and 11 of Genesis, then you would have accepted the fact that there, 10 names, the last name is an important name who has 3 important sons. Sounds like a nursery rhyme. It fits together so well. So when it fits together that well, then that's suspect right away. Especially when you add to it the first point we gave you, he doesn't add up the years here. Because let's assume there were really 15 names here. But he gives us 10. Well, he can't add up those 10 and say this is how much time was between there, because he would have left out 5 generations. And, of course, seeing the great ages, at least in the 5th chapter, that the men were when they had their firstborn son, that might have left out 500 or above years. So we would have had a very off-center date for creation, and, in fact, Moses would have deceived us to add them up if it's not a strict chronology. Now, if it is, then sure, add them up and we'll know the date of creation. But it appears to be a little artificial. Then in the third place, on internal reasons. In the third place, we've got much additional information given to us in chapters 5 and 11, which is totally irrelevant to a strict chronology interpretation. Let's go back to chapter 5. We've got a whole lot of additional information given to us. In other words, if, as was generally believed, as was believed by Usher, and generally speaking up until the time of William Henry Green's paper, if Moses was writing chapter 5 and chapter 11 for the purpose of giving us dates, if he was writing chapters 5 and 11 for the purpose of giving us dates, then why so much additional information that we don't need to know if we're trying to figure out dates? Unless the purpose of the chapter is perhaps manyfold, morefold than just figuring up some dates and finding out when creation was and when the flood was. Now in chapter 5, this is the way it's set up. You'll have to write it down. A lived X years and begat B. And again, you'll see when I give this, you see each one of these reasons ties into another one. You'll see the perfect symmetry here. A lives X years and begets B. A lived Y years after he begat B, and he begat sons and daughters. A lived Z years and he died. No exceptions except Enoch, who didn't die. A lived X years. So we've got two different people really spoken of, A and B. A has B. Then we have three periods of time mentioned, X, Y, Z. A, from the time he was born, lived X years until he begat B. Then he lived Y years after he begat B, and he begat C, D, E, F, and G on down the line. Then, what does Moses do? He takes X and Y and adds them up and gets Z. A lived a total of Z years. X plus Y equals Z. A lived a total of Z years, and then he died. Now, I can give you a reference here so you can see where it fits. We'll back to chapter 5, verse 3. Adam, A, lived 130 years, X years, and begat, well, the end of the verse, Seth, B. Verse 4. A, Adam, lived after he begat B, Seth, 800 years, which is Y, and begat sons and daughters. Then verse 5, and all the days of A were Z years, 930 years, and he died. So A lived X years, begat B. A lived Y years after he begat B and begat sons and daughters. And A lived Z years, and then he died. Now then, if you go over to chapter 11, the genealogical pattern is going to be a little different for chapter 11. We're going to have at least a couple of things missing that we had in chapter 5. And it goes like this. A lived X years and begat B. A lived Y years after he begat B, and he begat sons and daughters. Well, that's all. Now we've only got 2 steps. Just the same as chapter 5 in its first 2 steps. It's just that we don't have the last step, and A lived Z years and he died. So we're missing 2 things in chapter 11. Number 1, we're missing the totaling of the years. That would be Z years. And number 2, we're missing the ubiquitous reference to the fact that the patriarch, regardless of how long he lived, nevertheless died. So chapter 11 I'll give you again. A lived X years and begat B. Then A lived Y years after he begat B and begat sons and daughters. Let's just skip down to verse 12. Verse 12 of chapter 11. Arpachshad, A, lived 35 years, X, and begat Shelah, B. And Arpachshad, A, lived after he begat Shelah, B, 403 years, Y years, and he begat sons and daughters, period. And then it picks up with Shelah after that. So to make sure you're not confused, we'll go back over both of them quickly. Chapter 5, A lived X years and begat B. One man lived so many years before he has what appears to be, and underline the word appears, his firstborn son. Then A lived Y years after he begat B. That is, after he begat him until the time of his death. And during that time, Y years, however many years Y was, during Y years for Adam it was 800 years. For Y years he begat sons and daughters. And then finally, you add, or Moses adds, X and Y up for us. A lived Z years and he died. Then in chapter 11, A lived X years and begat B, the same as chapter 5. And then in the second place, the same in chapter 5, A lived Y years after he begat X, but he doesn't add up the years for us, and he begat sons and daughters. Okay, the question is, why is chapter 5 in the first place set up like this, and in the second place, chapter 11 set up like this? Obviously, negatively speaking to begin with, obviously, the purpose of chapter 5, as well as chapter 11, is not just to give us any dates. Because why have all this additional information? Why not just say Adam lived 930 years and he died? And then his son lived so many years, and he died, and here's all the time. Why give us he lived so long and he had a son, then he lived so long after that, then add it up, then tell us that he died, and before that tell us that he had all these sons and daughters? Unless some other purposes are being gotten across. And they're very simple, it's just that people read over them. Some of them we've covered before. So we'll start with chapter 5. Why is chapter 5 set up in this way? This is one of those teachings that ought to be easy to get notes because everything's a point. You know, you can't preach on a subject like this. Everything is a point. Come Friday night and we'll be preaching some more, or Sunday or something, but not tonight. Chapter 5. Why is it set up like this? Well, a couple of reasons. In the first place, it's set up like this to show us the remarkable age of the patriarchs, both at parenthood and at death. It didn't have to give the age of parenthood. It did need to give the age of death. But it didn't have to give the age of parenthood. Unless it's trying to show us something about these patriarchs, the great fertility that lasted for centuries in the men and in the women here in these early periods, these patriarchal men and women. Well, you couldn't have a patriarchal woman, a matriarchal woman, and a patriarchal man. So in the first place, to show the remarkable age of the patriarchs, both at parenthood and at death. Rather than just him tell us, now here's how many years were between Adam and the flood. Because that wouldn't tell us, well, how long did the individual people live during that period? And when he gives us all this information, then he tells us, well, some lived to be 950, some lived to be 980, some they got right up there near 1,000. And so he's letting us know how long individual people lived during the time period, as well as how old they were when they had their children. The second place, the purpose of chapter 5, is to show us that the command in Genesis 1:28 was being fulfilled. God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill up the earth. So chapter 5 and verse 4, for instance, lets us know that 1:28 is being fulfilled. The days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. To let us know that he lived plenty long enough to have all of these children so that 1:28 in Genesis could be fulfilled. If we didn't know how long they were living, then we'd have to assume everyone's having triplets or then some in order to do what chapter 1 and verse 28 said. But when they live to be 900 years old, you don't need to have triplets, just you have one child a year. And there you go, going to have 900 children right away, not counting any times you do have twins or triplets or so forth. So it's to let us know that 1:28 is being fulfilled. Then in the third place, and this is the sad message that is gotten across, which really brings along with it a message of hope and comfort when you really consider what's being said here and consider it in light of the New Testament, particularly Romans chapter 5, and that is the fact that regardless of how long they did live, chapter 2 and verse 17 and 3 and verse 19 were nevertheless continually being fulfilled, with the exception of Enoch. And what do those passages say? For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. It's rather sad that at every conclusion to the third verse, such as verse 5, verse 8, verse 11, it sticks on those three little words, and he died. You know, we would be perhaps in the place of praising the men for the great ages that they lived as though they were somehow almost gods or at least demigods. But it always ends with the fact, and he died. Verse 5, all the days that Adam lived, this great first patriarch, were 930 years. But what happened? He died after that. He never could get away, with one exception, Enoch, from the curse in 2:17 and from its prediction as well in chapter 3 and verse 19. In 2:17 he said, the day that you eat thereof you'll die, and death will pass upon all men. And then he said for a second time to Adam in chapter 3 and verse 19, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. So regardless of how long they lived, regardless of the great ages that they reached, they still always died. And he's wanting to get across that point that men die because of sin. Although they lived to be almost 1,000 years old, well over 9 centuries, they still nevertheless always die. Then we go to chapter 11. Why is chapter 11 set up like this? Because notice, if you go back to your little A lived X years and begat B diagram, chapter 11 has only 2 steps. Chapter 5 has 3 steps. Chapter 11 is missing the third or the last of the steps that I gave you in chapter 5, which was A lived Z years and he died. And I said he's missing 2 things. Missing the addition of the years, Z years, missing the fact that he died. So why is chapter 11 set up the way it is? In the first place, the lack of the total age is pointing us towards the fact that the post-diluvian lifespan was not nearly as great nor as remarkable as the antediluvian lifespan. I'm going to put this up on the overhead, which we have shown you before. Of the post-diluvian patriarchs, because we'll need it again in a moment as well as now, to show you why go to the trouble of adding up the years. The reason he's adding up the years in chapter 5 is to show us this tremendous age, this remarkable age to which they all attained. But since the ones in chapter 11 didn't get anywhere near the ones in chapter 5, chapter 11 would almost be anticlimactic if you gave an A lived the final totality of years, and then he died afterwards. It would be almost anticlimactic, because there you're going to have a lot fewer years than you had back in chapter 5. And so you can look and see, what do we have for Adam? 930. The oldest one here is the first one, Shem, 600. And notice how small all the other years are. The death of someone like Nahor, all the way down to 148 years old. So there's no sense in totaling it up when it's only 148 years. So there's a different purpose in chapter 11 in that regard than in chapter 5. Then in the second place, the lack of reference to death shows us the critical importance of chapter 9 and verse 1. There's no reference to death. You see, it will end, such as in verse 11 of chapter 11, Shem lived, this would be our second step. The first one was Shem lived 100, or Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Then the second point, verse 11, Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years, begat sons and daughters. And then he just doesn't mention anything about him again. But turn back to chapter 9 and verse 1. Now we have a repetition of Genesis 1:28, because these people are living right after the flood. Then to always be mentioning death would be really to diminish the remark that's here in chapter 9 and verse 1. God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now if they're all dying at 148, and you're always telling us that they're all dying at 148, although they don't, at least one of them dies as young as 148. We would say today as old as 148. But for them as young as 148, then again that's anticlimactic when you compare that with chapter 9 and verse 1. The purpose is, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Well, how can I'm dying when I'm only 148 years old? Whereas the death is told to us back in chapter 5, but not here in chapter 11. Now the exception, remember, that we had back in chapter 5 is Enoch, verses 21 through 24. So obviously you have to insert him into the picture and say he's an exception. But there weren't any other exceptions that were or at least told about here in these chapters. Now, if we go a little earlier to Genesis 4, just in case anyone raised the question, here we have another genealogy, but no ages at all are given here. Why? Well, Keel's explanation appears to be the best, and that is these people, the descendants of Cain, were under the curse and had no future. And since they were under the curse and really had no future in God's plan, then there's no need to give any ages here in chapter 4. It's a likely answer because it's interesting that no ages are given in the genealogy in chapter 4. So that all sums up the third reason that we gave you. There's much information that's totally beside the point. It's additional and it's irrelevant to chapters 5 and 11 if all we're trying to do is get a strict chronology. We've got all this abundant testimony to all these different facts. It must mean that chapters 5 and 11 serve more purposes than providing us a strict chronology. Then moving along to a fourth reason. And that is, it appears that many of the sons are not firstborn, which really is going to be necessary if we're going to add them up strictly and chronologically. Many of the sons, if not most of the sons, are not firstborn, but they are part of the messianic link, and that's why they are included. It's interesting that not just many and not just most, but all of the important sons that serve as messianic links in the book of Genesis, about whom we're given much information, none of them are firstborn sons. Seth, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez, Abraham, not one son about whom we're given a lot of information who serves as a messianic link is a firstborn son anywhere in the book of Genesis. I'm not saying that you couldn't have a firstborn, just not any of the firstborn sons about whom we are given a lot of information. For instance, let me give you some passages. Genesis 16:16, Isaac was not a firstborn son. Ishmael was the firstborn. Genesis 25:25, Jacob was not a firstborn son. Esau was the firstborn. Genesis 29:35, Judah was the fourthborn son. Then 1 Samuel 16:11, David was the lastborn son. None of these important sons that serve as messianic links are firstborn sons. So we can raise the question, well, what about some of these names we have in Genesis 5 and 11? If they're not firstborn sons, then it's going to be interesting. Well, we can start with the very first one that's mentioned in verse 3 of chapter 5. Seth is not a firstborn son. Chapter 5, verse 32, Shem is not a firstborn son. Japheth was the firstborn. Shem is not a firstborn son. Chapter 11 and verse 10 with chapter 10 and verse 22, Arpachshad was not a firstborn son. You'll look over in chapter 11 and verse 10, and notice what it says here. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arpachshad. Now, wouldn't we all agree that it appears to be the case, according to 11:10, that Shem's first child was Arpachshad? But look in chapter 10 and verse 22. The way they are listed here, we're going to get just the opposite implication. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, and then Arpachshad. Now, if Arpachshad was firstborn, why isn't he mentioned first here? He's mentioned third, as if, no doubt, he probably was the third-born son. Now, the one that's more interesting than any of them is Abraham. And do we have time? We really don't have time to get into Abraham because there's a lot that we have to say about Abraham in chapter 11. So I think we'll stop there and come back to some passages in the Old Testament, some passages in the New Testament about Abraham, and then the consideration, well, so what? Even if the firstborn sons aren't mentioned, as long as you've got only one son mentioned per family, then it doesn't matter whether it's a thirdborn. It doesn't matter if it's the thirdborn one time, the secondborn the next time, and the firstborn the third time, as long as you're not skipping over anything, but you're still going strictly chronologically. In other words, you wouldn't have to count any years concerning when your firstborn son or your secondborn son was born, as long as you covered all of the years between when you were born and when your thirdborn son, whatever name you're wanting to use in the genealogical list, whatever name you want to use, as long as you mention how much time occurred between when you were born and when that son was born, and then you use that son, and not your firstborn or your secondborn, but you use that son to calculate further ages. Then it's still end fits on to end with no gaps and with no overlapping. So you see, we can come up right away with the question, well, so what? Even if it wasn't the firstborn, how does that hurt a strict chronology interpretation?